We're on the eve of a brand new Formula 1 era, and we've seen the 6 days of running from the 10 teams on the grid, so it's time to rank them from worst to best. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. With new regulations, the team have had double the amount of testing time compared to last season, with 2 different circuits and different track conditions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have more of an idea of a pecking order. However, I'm going to go for my best guess as to which of these teams will be the fastest and which will be the slowest based on what I've seen. I'll also caveat that I've been trying to write this script over the course of the 3 days of testing in Bahrain, and there are some teams on this list that have moved around 4 or even 5 positions, which shows just how much we don't know as outsiders and how this is purely a best guess based on the information available to me. Number 10, Williams. Williams is a team that has been much higher up on this list during the Bahrain test, but the lack of performance running has held them back. The team definitely have a reliable car and one that in Barcelona looked to be quite well set up, but they've failed to continue this into Bahrain. Their day 2 running in Bahrain was hampered by a mistake from the team, which led to a rear end fire and just 12 completed laps. This meant that they prioritised race runs on the Saturday when the other teams were looking to complete some qualifying simulations in the cooler evening conditions. So with little representative lap time on display, it's a challenge to place them in the pecking order, hence right now I have them in 10th. It feels like a pretty weak excuse to put them last, but every other team has displayed some stronger pace. In Barcelona, Williams put in the 7th fastest time, and in Bahrain they were 10th. But that time was set on a different day and not during a qualifying run. Despite completing just 12 days on day 2 in Bahrain, they did manage 258 laps over the course of the 3 days of running. So there is some reliability in that car when they don't make silly errors, and that may well mean that they have the edge over some of the other teams ahead of them from a reliability perspective. And reliability could end up being a major factor in the early part of this season. But overall, with less pace than their competitors, I think Williams sit 10th, albeit with a huge amount of potential to sit much higher up in this order. Number 9, Alfa Romeo. Next is Alfa Romeo, and after a slow start in Barcelona, they've developed their car well through the 6 days of running. They've struggled particularly with porpoising, with floor damage after the first test in Barcelona, and had I done this ranking after those first 3 days, they would have been stone dead last. In terms of the statistics, they completed just 175 laps in Barcelona and then 343 in Bahrain, and that alone shows how much this car has improved between the tests. In particular, Alfa Romeo's porpoising problems from Barcelona subsided in Bahrain, and they reportedly had a stronger floor to ensure they could withstand the harsh forces that these cars have to handle. They started to manage the bouncing issue, and actually, the car started to show its potential, with Zhou putting in a competitive time in the morning session of day 3 in Bahrain. Once the other teams put in their fastest laps later in the day, the time didn't look quite so impressive, with Bottas posting the 6th fastest time in Bahrain. But he then pulled up, ending the team's testing campaign early with what looked like a gearbox issue in the final afternoon session. Some are placing Alfa Romeo as high as 4th in their lists, but for me, I have doubts over those quick runs. They might have dropped to qualifying fuel runs with as little weight as possible, but time will tell for Alfa Romeo as we see if they've actually been able to produce a faster car than last year. Number 8, Alpine. Alpine next, and this team is another one that looks like it could well be in the midfield on its day. They've had some issues with reliability and porpoising, with the team competing 266 laps in Barcelona and 299 in Bahrain. These numbers aren't awful by any means, but they aren't amazing either, and so this is why they will likely be in the midfield. Similar to Alfa Romeo, it seems like the Alpine team has the potential to be fast over 1 lap, with Alonso setting the 4th fastest time in Bahrain on the final afternoon of running. So there is definitely potential, and it seems like the Alpine car runs better in the warmer conditions relative to their rivals. And again, the midfield is likely to change on a regular basis with multiple different teams potentially 4th fastest, so this is likely to be one that will change on a regular basis throughout the season. I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already done so, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Number 7, Aston Martin. I've got Aston Martin in 7th, and again, it's another team that's tough to place, as they've shown some significant performance improvements over the course of the testing weeks. They have side pods that look relatively similar to Ferrari, which is a different concept to the other Mercedes power unit runners, but it looks like it has reasonable reliability, and the pace is one that again seems to be okay. I think they'll be there in the midfield pack, as both drivers have shown they could get some good pace out of the car in the long runs. The Aston Martin has struggled with porpoising like most teams on the grid, but they've shown glimpses of decent pace, and if they can manage that at each of the circuits, they can find themselves further up than 7th. I think Aston Martin will be one of those who will be better at some tracks than others, so it will be about maximising any opportunities that they get throughout this year. Number 6, Haas. Next up is a team that's had all manner of issues with testing this year, and that's Haas. The team's first test was completed under the shadow of the team splitting apart from their title sponsor, Uralkali. The team took action going into the third day of that test by removing the branding from the car, and then subsequently between the two tests, the team announced that they would be dropping the team's driver associated with that title sponsor, Nikita Mazepin. It was a turbulent time for the team, with questions over their funding position and who would take the Russian driver's place on the grid. And again, the Haas team acted quickly, bringing back one of their former drivers, Kevin Magnussen. And I think that was a great move, as they've strengthened the partnership considerably for this season. But things got worse for the Haas team, as a freight issue meant that they were unable to run the car in the morning session of day 1, but following a vote from the teams, they were given the opportunity to make up that running time by extending the following days. They definitely took advantage of this, with Magnussen putting his Haas car to the top of the standings on Friday and Schumacher going second fastest on Saturday. So this car, whether low fuel or not, looks far more competitive than in the last couple of years. And this might be optimistic, but I'm putting them 6th and certainly within the midfield pack with the opportunity to compete for points this season. Number 5, Alfa Tauri. Next up is a team that seemed to have gone a bit under the radar in testing, but for me, Alfa Tauri have got a reliable car. The team managed to complete the second most laps in Bahrain with 371 over the 3 days, even posting the fastest time on day 1. So I think they've got a good car, and I'm sure they'll be there or thereabouts, and I'm sure they'll be benefiting from their partnership with Red Bull. The mileage will have allowed the AlphaTauri team and drivers to run multiple race distances, and the more laps the better at this stage when it comes to maximising the performance from their car. There's definitely some potential for AlphaTauri to top the midfield for me this season, but having said this, any team could be at the front of this section, and certainly on the face of it, it's incredibly close between all the teams at this early stage. Number 4, McLaren. It's McLaren in 4th, and this team could either be 4th or they could be last based on their reliability concerns. They have a huge amount of raw speed, but they can't stop their car, with their brake ducts not being designed for the speeds that their car's delivering. It's an issue that's caused all manner of problems for the team in Bahrain, and it might take a few races to solve it. For me though, the McLaren car itself is incredibly fast, and one that doesn't seem to be causing too many problems with the porpoising when compared to other teams on the grid. So if they find a way to stop the car reliably, then they'll be up there and able to compete. And if they don't get that sorted, then it might be a flop early on in the 2022 season. In addition, you have to question what the impact's going to be on Ricciardo, who's had half the amount of running time as his colleagues, which may mean he could struggle to hit the ground running next weekend. Number 3, Mercedes. Mercedes in 3rd, and the reason they are there is because I cannot believe that they could be any lower after being so strong over the last 8 seasons. The team have a reputation for sandbagging in testing, and so it's hard to believe that they aren't hiding something this year. But they do go 3rd for me, as they seem to have some real issues with porpoising, and the drivers are struggling to control the car. Having said this, there were also some reports that they weren't turning their engine up to the max, but even at the lower speed they continue to have issues with porpoising, and with my limited knowledge of aerodynamics, I would assume that at higher speeds the issue's only going to get worse. So they no doubt have a lot of work to do going into this season next week, as they look to find a way to maximise their car without going too far and exacerbating the problems and making the car undrivable. If there is any team that have the capability to improve their car so quickly after testing, it's definitely Mercedes, and we saw that last year. I'm also sure that if they find a way to make their tiny side pod concept work, it will be strong, but time will tell if they can get themselves in a position where they could compete for race wins. Number 2, Ferrari. And in 2nd, I've gone for Ferrari. They sat top of my provisional list after Barcelona, as their car looked great out of the box. It looks quick and balanced, and both drivers seem to have confidence in the car. As such, they've been able to get a huge amount of running in, with 439 laps in Barcelona and 349 in Bahrain. This means that they will have completed several race simulations and had time to run various car setups, and have probably completed their goals. One thing that Ferrari didn't do compared to Mercedes and Red Bull was bring a whole new specification of car that looked radically different. I'm sure they'll have brought upgrades that might have been less obvious than the others, which is why this isn't a concern. Likewise, with more wind tunnel and CFD time compared to their rivals last year, they will have probably got further into the development cycle, so their car will have gone through those iterations already. So for me, Ferrari are one of the teams to beat, and they've only just been beaten to the number 1 spot during the final testing runs on Saturday afternoon. Number 1, Red Bull. And finally, the team that I think will be the ones to beat in 2022 will be Red Bull. The team's upgrades on day 3 in Bahrain worked immediately, and both drivers got up to speed quickly. It was incredibly impressive, and the team in the garage looked delighted with the quality of their performance and how fast these drivers were. Not only this, but they were well on top of their porpoising problems, and it seemed to be running at a slightly higher rate in order to have a car that's easier to handle and can still maintain some significant pace. I think they'll be up against it with Ferrari, but those times towards the end of the test session were really impressive. Verstappen's initial pace coming on tyres that had suffered from a spin from the previous lap. It was a strong performance from the team, and this doesn't mean that they'll run away with things in 2022, but I think at least for the first few races, they'll be the ones to beat. And with that in mind, it's difficult not to see Verstappen as the driver who'll be on top in 2022. So those are my rankings, and as I've said throughout this video, the teams in the midfield on the face of it look so incredibly close this season, and I expect that there'll be some tracks that will be better for some teams and other tracks that will be better for the others. But that will hopefully mean that we're in for an incredibly competitive year. And if you want to learn more about the cars themselves and which drivers might come out on top, then make sure you watch this video next.